I would like to congratulate the conference committees for organizing such an important event. I would also like to thank you for attending this session today, and in particular I would like to thank Professor Robert Burden for accepting to participate in this conference, and we are very happy and pleased to receive you here at Lisbon in this event. So unfortunately, Professor Maria de Taveira cannot be here today because she has suffered a little accident, but I'm happy to be here, and my name is Iris Oliveira. I also come from University of Minho. So, Professor Robert Burden is an emeritus professor of applied educational psychology at the University of Exeter in southwest England, and he is also the director of the Graduate School of Education's Cognitive Education Development Unit. Professor Burden's unique work has been widely recognized and reinforced by some of the most important international scientific organizations. For instance, Professor Burden was elected as a Fellow of the British Psychological Society since 1982. He was also gifted with the Distinguished Service Award from the International School of Psychology Association in 2006, and he was also elected as an Honorary Vice President of the British Association of Counseling and Psychotherapy in 2007. Professor Burden has also continuously contributed for the scientific progress and disclosure of the school psychology field through his participation as an editor of the School Psychology International Journal since 1985 and as a member of the editorial board of the Learning Environment Research Journal and of the Teaching Skills and Creativity Journal. So Professor Burden has written a remarkable number of journal articles, books and book chapters, as well as has participated in several international conferences. Professor Burden's research interests focus on cognitive education, dyslexia, students' perceptions of their own engagement in school and education, assessment of classroom environments, motivation, thinking skills, among others. So we are very pleased to receive Professor Burden in this conference, and I hand over the floor to Professor Burden right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Estelle. Hola, buenos dias, good morning. It's really good to see you, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm particularly pleased to be here because up until a few weeks ago, I might not have been able to make it. It's because last year I suffered a severe illness, and only until recently was it confirmed that I could leave the country. So this is my first trip outside of the United Kingdom for 2 years, so I'm really pleased to come to a lovely place like Lisbon and to this conference to make that journey. I'd also like to thank Professor Vega and his team for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be a consultant to their excellent work that they're doing in the field of student engagement, which interestingly is not a topic which is much researched in the United Kingdom. So coming here, already I've learned a great deal. I learned a great deal from the symposium yesterday. I learned a great deal from meeting my new friend, Dr. James Appleton, who introduced me to a research literature I knew nothing about yesterday. So I recommend, if you can stay until tomorrow afternoon, make sure you go to his session, because you will find it stimulating and fascinating, as I already have done. My only regret is that, as a stupid Englishman, I only speak 1.5 languages, quite good English and very poor French. But if I could speak Portuguese, I'm sure that I would have learnt a lot from some of the other contributions that have been made this last few days. Now I'll start with a confession, and the confession is that my presentation will contain no statistics, no graphs, no numbers of any kind. So if you came expecting or hoping for an array of brilliant statistics, you're most welcome to leave now, because you won't get any. What I will try to do is to make my presentation in the form of a story. And it will be a linked story. The story will be one of my own journey as an educational stroke school psychologist, but also, as you can see from the title here, which is more up to date than it implies, it's a journey of educational school psychology certainly over the last 50 years. Because I was trained 48 years ago as an educational psychologist, as we call them, in the English setting. Let's see. I'll put that up for you to be considering as I speak. I had a very, very good grounding in my first degree in psychology, in positivist methods. I then went and taught children with learning difficulties for several years. And then I went to train at what was considered the best training course in the United Kingdom in educational psychology, fired with enthusiasm that I was going to change the world by using my psychology in education. And I was trained to use IQ tests. I was trained to use the Stanford Binet and the WISC, and that was going to be the way in which I was going to change the world. So when I went out to practice as an educational psychologist in the United Kingdom. Now, already I should state, in the United Kingdom, we are called educational psychologists. In the rest of the world, we're called school psychologists. So already we have a dilemma there in terms of definition. What exactly is an educational psychologist? What exactly is a school psychologist? And how do the two ever meet, if at all? And so that's going to be one of the themes of my talk as I go along. Because I think that they don't. In fact, I'm sure that they don't. And I'm sure that in many, if not most, universities across the world, you have the educational psychology department in one part of the university, the school psychology department in another part of the university, and if they talk to each other, then they're doing very well. If they actually work together, they are performing some kind of miracle. I don't know how it is here, but that's very, very significant wherever you go. And why should it be? It doesn't make any kind of sense at all. Now, being British and being cantankerous, as we say, we decided to make it even more confusing, because whereas in the rest of the world you've got the two different groups, in the United Kingdom we're just called educational psychologists, even though the two groups still exist in splendid isolation of each other. So it's a very strange situation. Now, what happened in the United Kingdom was, of course, that what the school psychologists, I'll call them school psychologists, decided was that their route to helping, to contributing to the education system was through psychometrics, and what they chose was the most inappropriate psychometric that you can imagine. And what I discovered when I went out to work as a school psychologist, and in my first job as a school psychologist in the United Kingdom, where at that time school psychologists were only employed by what we called local education authorities, that is, by school districts, and you were employed by them and you worked in schools. In the school district that I worked in, I had a population of 70,000 children and more than 200 schools that I was supposed to serve. And the way in which I was supposed to serve it was by using IQ tests. So I became very, very adept at giving what I call a super fast whisk. I could give a whisk in 20 minutes and analyse it in just about the same amount of time and write a report in about the same amount of time. But the faster I went at learning how to give IQ tests, the more convinced I became how stupid it was. And yet, schools seemed to be quite happy with me doing this, for some reason, which I was never able to fathom. And then, in 1971, I was asked whether I would begin the first ever training course for educational school psychologists in the University of Exeter in the west of England. And I was determined that I was going to run a school psychology training service which was very different from the one that I'd received, and which was going to meet the needs of schools and the children within schools, and that we were going to change the world. So all the time there's been this vision that I've had that the application of psychology to the education system should be able to make an impact and change the world in some way. When I retired, I'll jump ahead, when I retired officially in 2005, I became convinced that we'd got no further forward than we had been in the 1970s in that respect. And I think that the great danger for school psychology, educational psychology, is that it will actually die out as a profession if we do not change in some significant ways. I've seen this around the world. In the United Kingdom, the least well-regarded aspect of applied psychology is educational psychology. Clinical psychology is held in high repute. If I were to advise anyone in the United Kingdom to be an applied psychologist, I'd say, be a sports psychologist. You make a lot of money and you make a big impact and you get a very good reputation. But think twice about being an educational psychologist, because you will be at great risk unless you can actually perform in some way which is rather different from the way that we have been in the past. So when I began my educational psychology training course, the first thing I did was to make a statement, and that was that we will not train any of our psychologists in the use of IQ tests. Now that, of course, led to a dilemma, and I wrote a paper which was quite controversial, in fact very controversial in 1974, and the title of the paper was, "If we throw the tests out of the window, what is there left to do?" And the answer was, we don't know. And so we spent a number of years trying to discover what the alternatives might be. And the alternative that we chose at Exeter was to follow the path of what's called systems psychology. That what I saw, the role for the applied psychologist was as a consultant to educational systems. Unfortunately, we didn't really know how we could become consultants, effective consultants to education systems, and the education systems didn't seem to want us anyway. All they wanted was this IQ figure, so that, because at the time in the United Kingdom, this was a route to resources. If you could give a child a particularly low IQ, then you could get extra resources for the education of that child. And this was seen as the most valuable, one of the most valuable ways forward for educational psychologists. So here we have the main problem, which I think Donald Schoen actually, from a different perspective, really lays out for us. He sees this, the area in which we're working as a kind of a swamp. So on the highlands, sorry, where are we? Yeah. On the high ground, we've got problems which lend themselves to research, theory, and techniques. And this has been the ground which has been traditionally taken by the academic educational psychologists. But in the swampy grounds down below, the school psychologists have been trying to meet the needs of schools and the children and the families. And this is where the big problems have tended to lie. And until recently, I would contend that academic psychology hasn't had much to offer. Right. So in 2000, there was a report by our Department for Education and Enterprise. And I don't know whether you have the same situation here, but in the United Kingdom, every time we change government, they change the name of the education department. So you can't actually remember who it is. So we always call it the education department, although the official title is something very different. The other thing that happens, and this I think will be relevant as I go through, is that every time a government changes, they have a new, we call it the Secretary of State for Education, a new member of the cabinet who is responsible for education, who is determined to overturn everything that the previous education secretary actually set in motion. So we had a particularly interesting curriculum prior to our last election in 2010, and the new man who's come in has changed the whole thing completely. So we're now in a very strange situation, and what he's trying to do is to set in motion, or set in place a number of laws before the next election, just in case, as seems likely, the government will change again and make it too late for the next government to change, or will make it too difficult for them to change the laws. So we are in this really, really strange situation. Now, you can see here that this particular report suggested that applied educational school psychologists, or they called it psychs, should be to promote child development and learning through the application of psychology. They don't say what kind of psychology. By working with individuals and groups of children, teachers and other adults in schools, families, and other LEA officers, other local education officers. Now what the most recent man has done is to break on. So we no longer have local education authorities. So schools now, we have a new school curriculum which is gone back to the 19th century, where this man has said everything depends upon knowledge, upon memory, upon the basics in education. But he's also said we will not any longer have what you might call school districts, local authorities. Schools can now call themselves academies, and if you are an academy, you don't have to follow the curriculum. You can do whatever you like. So it's a very, very odd situation. So we're having now more and more schools determined to become academies, so they don't have to actually apply this curriculum which is now bringing in. It seems a totally crazy world, but this is the world in which we are living at the present time. In England in particular, now Wales and Scotland are slightly different. And notice here that we're supposed to be working with health and social services and other agencies. Now what then happened was, the last government then brought in something called Every Child Matters, which is pretty simplistic really, but what they said was that the role of every school should make sure that children and young people should be healthy, stay safe, enjoy and achieve, make a positive contribution, achieve economic well-being. Well, you couldn't take issue with that really, could you? But they also said that educational psychologists should play a significant part in that, but they shouldn't work on their own, that they should work with social services, children's services of different kinds, and so therefore the identity of educational psychologists began to be undermined. So when my friend Peter Farrell did a review of this, of the psychologist's contribution to this Every Child Matters agenda, they found there was a great involvement in multi-agency work, there were positive reports from service users, that's from schools and so on. There was less statutory work, less work on giving IQ tests and the wider delivery services, but at the same time, less and less work in schools. So psychologists were being moved out of schools by this particular law which the last government brought in. Now what I'm going to be saying later is that we cannot get away from the fact that politics actually influences everything we do. I expect it's totally different in your country, but you cannot get away from the fact that wherever you're working, the politics of the country will make a great influence upon the profession that you are able to carry through. Now what I'm going to go on to say is that almost in the face of this crazy man that we have at the moment as Education Secretary, it could not be a better time for educational psychologists to change the world. But that's my theme, okay? And perceptions that much of the work that the educational psychologists were doing could have been done by others. You know, you didn't have to have, you could have less expensive other professionals who were doing the same things. Okay. Now, I'll pass through this. I was just going to put this up because for the sake of James and of Feliciano and others. Until I came here, even though I had been interacting with Feliciano, the notion of school engagement was not one with which I was particularly familiar. It is not one which is used in the United Kingdom. But we had been doing very similar work under the guise of motivation. And already I've had some interesting discussions with James, and I've picked up from the people from Feliciano's team that many of the themes of the aspects of school engagement are those which we have been picking up under the guise of motivation. And we can now talk, as James was saying to me yesterday, well, motivations, a lot of people say, doesn't actually include the actual behavioural component, and engagement means motivating and taking it through. Our definition of motivation has always been you cannot be motivated unless you actually follow it through and you continue to do so. So, for example, I've always felt that I wanted to play the piano, and some people would say, well, you were motivated to do that. But because I've never, whenever I've tried, I've never followed it through, then I would say I was never truly motivated. You might say that you were never truly engaged. So there is a kind of limit in definition here in some ways, but the point I was really trying to make is that many of the very same concepts that we've been talking about in other places, people may be working on under different titles. So here is one of my points that I've been trying to make it in a diagrammatic form. So here we have in the centre what you might call school or educational psychology. And what it's supposed to be is an amalgamation of psychology and education. So they should be pulling together, but in fact in many ways, certainly in the past, what they've been doing is pulling apart. Hopefully now that is beginning to change, but it's taken a long time. And one of the reasons for that, there should be some kind of reciprocity. But one of the reasons for the fact that they have been pulling apart is that, as I've said before, they are influenced, there are pressures upon school educational psychologists from the legislation that takes place in the country, from the economic situation that we find ourselves in different ways. As the economic situation gets worse in Europe, then politicians will be looking at people like school psychologists and saying, are they value for money? Are they actually worth it? Can we get people to doing the same things for a lot less? And I don't know whether it's the same across the United States, but there they would employ psychometricians doing the job that we had educational psychologists doing at far less money. And then what we have is the influence of various philosophies and the values. What is our value system? How do we value education? How do we value what aspects of psychology? And what I believe to be an undervalued contribution to school and educational psychology, which is sociology. And I shall say a little bit more about later, because again in the past, psychologists have tended to turn their noses up a bit at sociologists and say they don't really know what they're doing, they're all very woolly. But I believe that there is a great deal in sociological theory that actually can be helpful to us. And so what school educational psychologists need to do is to be reflexive, to be reflexive and to change in accordance with these different pressures and to try to develop and to find their way through, negotiate, if you like, their way through the swamp in certain ways. As long ago as 1968, we had a report by a man called Arthur Summerfield. And he's arguing here the particular contribution of psychologists in education services derives from the specialised study of psychological science and its application to education and other aspects of human development. It should be the main criterion in determining their work. Actually, you know, when you think about it, how many years ago was that? Something like 43 years ago. And it still makes sense to me. But it's never really been applied as well as it should be. Sometime later, and again, maybe someone like James can tell me this, the Division of Educational Psychology of the American Psychological Association came up with this definition, and they talked about the theories and principles of human learning, teaching and instruction, and added to that theory-derived education materials, programs, strategies, and so on, that can enhance lifelong activities and processes. Now, I think there's a lot to be said for this, and yet we've never really, in many ways, applied either of these definitions in the ways that I think we could. We'll go past this. Now, I talked a little bit before in my diagram about the importance of theory. What is the theory? Now, yesterday, Shane Jimerson was talking about his model, but he didn't really talk about the theory upon which that model is built. And I think our theory, our theoretical grounding, is vitally important. Now, I would call myself, in many ways, a socio-cultural theorist, a neo-Vygotskian. And I think we've moved forward in that direction. And the interesting thing, again, is that when we first started looking for alternatives to psychometric testing, the prevailing view in our country was behaviorism. And behaviorism took sway for many years, with people seeing that Skinner had the answer to all our problems. And we took a long time to realise that he didn't at all, that behaviorism was very limited in what it could offer. And in 1982, I discovered the work of an Israeli psychologist called Reuven Feuerstein. And Feuerstein, at the time, had produced two books, very interesting books. The first book was called The Dynamic Assessment of Retarded Performers. And Feuerstein put forward the theory in that book that we should be looking at dynamic assessment as an alternative to static assessment. And at the time he was considered to be a little bit crazy. But over the years, more and more, the notion of dynamic assessment has come in as being a really worthwhile, if not alternative, but certainly complementary aspect of assessment that we can do in schools and work with teachers in schools. The other book that he wrote was called Instrumental Enrichment, and in this book, what he did was to lay out the theory that by teaching children to learn how to learn, to become effective thinkers, what we can do is actually to enable them to be much better lifelong learners than by following the kind of formal curriculum that we have in many schools across the world. And again, his ideas were dismissed as being really far too way out at the time. And we tried to introduce his ideas into our training in Exeter. And again, they fell on fallow ground. They didn't really take off. And I could never quite understand why they didn't take off. Because the ideas, I think, are vital. So when I come down to what is our theoretical perspective, I'm a great believer in the work of Lev and Wenger and this notion of situated cognition. And for me, these underpin all the work that we do and that I believe in. So there's some very important points here. That learning is context specific. Learning doesn't take place in a vacuum. I find myself questioning, and I'm only questioning, but I'm questioning whether in the international surveys you really can make a comparison between countries. Because what I know about my visits to different countries is that the education systems are very different, that I believe that the work that you're doing here on engagement in Portugal is absolutely vital for Portugal. I'm not at all sure whether that will follow across to South Korea, for example, in what I know about that. So I believe that all learning is context specific, that meaning is constructed within communities of practice, that learning is a dialectical process of interaction, that knowledge is located in the actions of persons and groups, that cognition depends on the use of a variety of artifacts and tools, for example, language and culture, with culture being vitally important here, and that situations only make sense within historical context. What I've tried to show is the way in which the historical context really plays a vitally important part, and I believe now, we talk about the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. I believe now it's a vitally important zeitgeist, that we can grasp this. This is what we're trying to do in England at the moment. But if we don't, then things could become very dangerous. Cognition is best understood as a dynamic interplay between an individual and social levels, and this notion of a self is a constructed artifact, which will vary according to the different situations. So these are the principles that we're applying. Go beyond this, I think. Now, how do we represent this? This diagram is supposed to represent the way in which this is played out within an education system. So what we have in the centre is a school or a classroom. Within that classroom, you have mediators that is teachers who are working in a certain kind of way. They may be acting as instructors, but we believe that effective teachers should be mediators, and that we consider the students as mediatees. So there is a dynamic interaction between the mediators and the mediatees, and the way in which they do this is by applying, setting up various activities, using tools such as language and the application of various cultural artifacts within that situation. So that would be a typical classroom within, a situated cognition or socio-cultural aspect. But then all classrooms are set within psychological contexts, and they themselves are set within physical contexts. So schools across the world are different in different places. Last time I was in South Africa, and again we've talked here about size of classes. The class that I was actually interacting with was something like 50 to 70 children of all ages sitting under a tree. And that was the nature of their particular physical context within that classroom. And so the cultural factors which were impinging upon them were very different from the ones that we have in our very neat classrooms in Exeter, for example, where every school in recent years under the last government, every school in Exeter had a completely rebuilt school. It won't happen now. It was just before the economic downturn. And so, the historical context played a great influence on what happened in Exeter in the years between 2005 and 2010. And the historical context, so all of these are interacting. Now, if I were good at, or if I had someone who could do it for me, all this would be kind of in a three-dimensional interacting process. It's changing continually. But what I'm saying is that we have to take all these into account if we're going to understand what is happening, and if we're going to influence what is happening. Okay, I'll go beyond this because that's... right. So, when I retired in... I might go for a minute, yeah. When I retired formally in 2005, I'd been a school psychologist, I'd run the training course. I had actually given up that training course because I was asked to be what you would call the dean of the education faculty, and I felt that we could influence the way in which things happen in education by training teachers in aspects of psychological processes. And then I retired in 2005, and I could have sailed off into the sunset with a meagre but adequate pension. But I was given the opportunity, I was asked by the university if I would like to stay on, as long as they didn't have to pay me, and be what's called an emeritus professor. And I said I would like to because I want to find out why it is that these ideas about cognitive education, about teaching children to learn how to learn, haven't taken hold in this country. Is there something that we can do about it? So what might there be that we can do about it? And so we set up the Centre for Cognitive Education at Exeter, which has recently been renamed the Cognitive Education Development Unit because of the changes within the university. And we set out to see whether we could find out, first of all, why it hadn't been working, and secondly, whether we could do something about it. The revelation came when we appointed a professor who was a sociologist, and who was an expert in the area, and again, I don't know if you have it here, of school effectiveness. And school effectiveness has been particularly successful in identifying features that identify a successful school. So what the school effectiveness and the school improvement researchers, mainly sociologists, have done is to say, what makes a good school? And they identified a number of factors, some of which I will touch upon in a minute. And it made me realise that where we had gone wrong was we would be putting out these great ideas about the psychology of cognition, of learning how to learn. And individual teachers and psychologists would become very enthusiastic about that. And then they would go into schools and they would be met by resistance from other members of the school faculty, from people in the past, from school districts, and we realised that the only way forward was to take a whole school approach. That is, to apply systems theory, systemic thinking, to saying, if you want to change the world, first of all, you have to change the school system. How do you do that? Well, the idea is that what we do is to look at the curriculum, and our particular education secretary, as I said, has said that schools don't have to follow the national curriculum, they can set their own curriculum. The only criterion is that they must show that they can pass examinations at the age of 11 and 16. If they show that they can pass those examinations, if they show that they can be successful in a number of ways, then they can do whatever they like. Now again, if I come back to the cultural issues, what I'm already discovering is ways in which we are somewhat different. In the United Kingdom, we have never had the process of retention. So no children are ever held back in any way at all. You move through the system with your age group. The other thing, which some people seem to marvel at, is that we have no issue with dropout whatsoever. So if a school is, for example, has any kind of dropout rate of all 10%, is considered to be a failing school. So that what we're looking for now in our successful schools is above a 95% attendance rate. You're always going to get some who aren't there, but this is what we're looking for. We're looking for full-time attendance, certainly above 95%. But we're already got that advantage that we don't have to struggle in the way that some of you do with these particular issues. So here we are. We've got the task. And so what I started to do was to say, I set up a conference and invited teachers who might be interested in this cognitive education approach to come and talk about how we might go forward. And what we decided to do was to identify what was the nature of a so-called thinking school. If you think about it for a moment, in some ways it's a strange term because you would expect all schools to be thinking schools. But what was a school which actually took the principles of cognition that we know in psychology helps children to learn how to learn, and made that the foundation for the curriculum and for the pedagogy that took place throughout the school. And that was our objective. So the first thing that we did, I've run out of time, so I've got to finish there, so I can't tell you, I'm afraid. Was to look at what were the driving forces for this. And already we can see that the OEDC back in the World Bank in 2007 was already saying that, look, schools are turning out students who are not fit for purpose. We were having a very interesting discussion last night about can we predict the future? Well, one of the things that fascinated me yesterday was the way in which we have young people becoming engaged with futures perspectives. They're expecting their education is actually going to give them jobs, it's going to prepare them for a future. And when they get out there, they find that the future has changed, that their education hasn't prepared them at all. However engaged they might have been, that education has not been an appropriate education. So what the World Bank is saying in 2007 is that there are several types of skills that are needed to enhance a person's ability to perform well, either as entrepreneurs or workers in the private sector in the future. And we do not know what those skills might be. We do not know what the demands will be, but they've got to have the skills. And they are thinking skills, critical and creative thinking, the behavioural skills of perseverance, self-discipline, teamwork, the ability to negotiate conflict and manage risks, specific knowledge. We can't get away from the knowledge of numeracy and literacy, and vocational skills, which are a mix of specific knowledge and skills to perform jobs that rely on clearly defined tasks, but they may not be tasks which we know about yet. So they've got to be flexible thinkers who can apply these skills to no matter what the problems or the tasks are that they're faced with in the future. So the World Bank is asking for this, and yet our education systems are continuing to apply, to provide an education which is not fit for purpose. And in the United Kingdom we have a man who is actually saying we must go back to the previous century, because that's what we call a proper education, who is not listening to these messages. So we came up with a definition of a thinking school, and this is what it is. An educational community in which all members, that is everybody within the school, the teachers, the principal, the support staff, the people who serve the dinners, the students, everybody share a common understanding, and parents, and a vision of the nature of high quality learning and teaching for all pupils, right across the range, from those with the most severe difficulties to the gifted and talented, and are committed to working together to make this vision a reality. So that means everybody's got to be singing from the same hymn sheet, everybody's got to be on the same agenda. They think deeply about their work, reflectively, critically, and creatively. So they're applying the teachers, the thinking skills to their work, and they're spending time discussing the best ways of co-constructing both a meaningful and a purposeful curriculum and associated activities, drawing on a wide range of learning opportunities. They're committed to their own learning, so although they're teachers, they're committed to learning themselves, to keeping abreast of research, learning from each other, open to new ideas, considering these carefully before deciding whether they will usefully contribute to their vision of a thinking school. So that is right. Now you might say, yeah, okay, that's pie in the sky in our terms. That is kind of, wow, way up there. So a school which is successfully developing as a thinking community will strive to ensure that all pupils are developing and demonstrating independent and cooperative learning skills and using a range of thinking tools and strategies. And the school would generate high levels of achievement and excitement and enthusiasm for lifelong learning. All members of the community would interact with and show consideration for each other in such a way as to enable the positive psychological well-beings of both pupils and staff to flourish. So what we're saying is, and some people get the wrong idea when I talk about a thinking school, of course we are committed to thinking effectively, to improve attainment, to make sure that people become engaged, but also that people interact in a way with each other which is respectful, which actually gives students and staff and everybody there this sense of belonging, that they want to be there, and that there is something there which is meaningful for them both now and in the future. Now, so I offered this as a vision, and to my amazement, something like 4 or 5 schools said, we'd like to sign up to that. We think that our school is moving that direction. So how can we go about doing it? So we began to arrange for training sessions within those schools in cognitive education. And there is a huge literature. There is an enormous amount of knowledge in how to develop cognitive skills, ranging from the work of Reuben Feuerstein, which is tremendous and mainly aimed at children with learning and severe learning difficulties, because Feuerstein starts with the premise that any child, any person of any age, however handicapped, for whatever reason, can become a fully effective learner. So he's arguing from that perspective, and at the other end of the scale, there's the argument that we are not doing justice by our gifted and talented, and in Platonic terms, as Plato said, these are children of gold, that we are not actually utilising in the right kind of way. So we also have the work of Matthew Lippmann and Philosophy for Children, which is another way of providing cognitive education. And we also have the work of Edward de Bono. And so there are a whole range of cognitive education programs which can be built into schools. And so what we began to do was to offer to schools the opportunity of training in these ways. And then they said, okay, how will we know that we're actually achieving it? So what we did then was to come up with a number of criteria, actually 14 criteria, that we said a school has to meet in order to be considered a thinking school. And we said that from the university, if a school can show that it can meet those criteria and provide us with a portfolio of evidence that it's meeting those criteria, and we can visit the school and it can show us that what is happening in the school is actually living those criteria, then we would provide them from the university with a trophy, a certificate which said you are a thinking school as accredited by the University of Exeter. And so these are the criteria that we came with very quickly. I'm almost finished now. So there was evidence needed that the principal, all the teachers, the support staff, what we have the school governors, the parents and actually the students as well, are all committed to this notion. That within the school there is a high status member of staff whose responsibility it is to ensure that they have, in an ongoing way, that this task force continues to train up people in cognitive education. So we have external and in-house training, we have whole school planning, implementation, reflection, reviews, an alternative approach to assessment whereby the students are learning how to assess themselves, to apply metacognition. Metacognition becomes the buzzword within the school. How can we actually do it to reflect on our own work on teachers? How can we get the students to reflect upon their own and each other's work? And we're looking at different kinds of learning outcomes, the attitudes towards themselves, towards school, the behaviour towards each other, and this notion of a whole school ethos to which everyone feels that they belong. What we found was that, to our amazement, we argued that it would take you something like 3 years to reach this. Within 2 years, we'd had our first 3 or 4 schools come. Now, what are we, 8, 13, 5 years later, we have across the United Kingdom 60 schools which have gone through this process and have shown that they can meet these criteria as thinking schools by applying cognitive psychology to the curriculum, to the pedagogy, and showing us that they are absolutely brilliant schools. And what's happened has been that the whole movement has taken fire. So we now have 2 schools in New Zealand, 2 schools in Australia. Most recently, the Prime Minister of Malaysia has decided that every school in Malaysia is going to be a thinking school. So he's now wanting them all to be trained in this particular process. And so just to finish, I'll just show you a few slides of the way in which the children themselves, and this ranges in schools from the infant level, from preschool level, 3, 4 upwards, right through to what you would call, to actually to 19 in the United Kingdom. And so they use things like visual organisers, thinking maps they're called. These are children who've learned how to compare and contrast the different aspects of their food. So you can take the same topics within the curriculum, but you're teaching them in a totally different way. So you're teaching children right from the very beginning the importance of making comparisons, how to compare and contrast. And it can be the food that they eat, it could be their friends, it could be different countries, it could be a whole range of things. So you can do this at whatever level that you want. This is a so-called circle map, which is a way of organising your ideas. And so what the children do is to collectively take the topic of earthworms, and what they do is to make suggestions as to what earthworms are about. Here is the Second World War, which has been looked at in a similar way by older children. A good friend, what makes a good friend? The children make their suggestions, and around the outside are the so-called frame of references where these ideas come from. You can look at mathematics in this particular kind of way. So you're teaching every aspect of the curriculum in this different kind of way, instead of teaching kind of rote mathematics and so on. All the schools have these maps, the ideas. What have we got here? Harry Potter, looked at in this kind of way, analysed. Comparison of Cornwall, a county in the United Kingdom, with Ghana, which is made by actually some primary school children. Looking at history, the Tudors, using one of these maps to analyse the way in which different materials can be put together. And this is all at a very young age, taking something like a healthy diet. So these are the different kind of topics. Instruments and the way in which we can look at the different uses for instruments. Looking at language, ways to say said, way in which this is used in ICT. The students themselves at a very young age taking on the notion of researchers and presenting their findings both throughout the school. So what they did was to go throughout this particular school and carry out a survey on what were the thinking tools that the children found most useful, present this in the form of early statistics, and then go out to other schools and begin to teach other schools how to do this, constructing their own definition of their school and so on. So that's where we're at. The thing is beginning to take form, and I should have retired, how many years ago now? A long time ago, yeah. I'm now 73 years old. I'm actually, half of me has been taken away because of cancer, and I do not want to stop, because I can see this vision that I had in the very beginning, that educational psychology could change the world, beginning to take shape in the way in which we are acting as a department, as a unit, a small unit. There are only 4 of us working together on this, but we've got other people involved elsewhere. The teachers now are training themselves, so schools are now becoming training centres for other schools in this kind of way. So the whole thing is beginning to mushroom. So I can only say, watch this space if you're interested. I will certainly, if you're interested, send you any information about this, and off we go.